ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Nunes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I always appreciate being introduced in a language that I don't speak because I always imagine the wonderful things that have been said about me. So I thank you for that warm welcome on behalf of my understanding of it. I want to talk to you today about some research we've done in the institute that I direct with Accenture, and the title of the book that we've put out recently is called Big Bang Disruption. But before I do that, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, I wanted to test your minds here in the afternoon. A little trivia question. See, how many of you have seen a phalaenopsis lately? Have you seen a phalaenopsis? You might have seen one in the lobby. You might have seen one in the grocery store. You might have seen one in one of the restrooms in the U.S. They're pretty popular in hotel. What is a phalaenopsis? Anybody want to know? Phalaenopsis is a orchid, and it's a moth orchid. And it's important to say it's a moth orchid because it's a Taiwanese invention. And the reason I'm going to talk to you today about the orchid business is because it has some parallels for this Big Bang disruption. So if you think about it, how many people have sort of noticed that there's a lot more orchids around? Have you noticed that? It seems like they're everywhere now, right? Well, why is that? Well, in fact, now they're the most popular, common potted plant in the entire world. They passed poinsettias a few years back. But orchids are interesting because, as we all probably intuit, they used to be very expensive. And why is that? They're very hard to grow. In fact, you have to seed them in temperature-controlled and humidity-controlled test tubes by the millions, which are computer-monitored. You then have to ship them to Taiwan, where they're grown for another 3 months. They're then shipped to China, where they grow for 3 to 6 months more. Then they're shipped back here to the Netherlands, where they're put into a colder environment, which forces them to bloom for 3 weeks. And then they take another 6 months to a year till they're full form. Now, why is that such an important story, and why would I talk about that? Is how much do you think it costs today to buy an orchid wholesale in the United States? Euros, dollars, $10, $20, $50, $3.86, less than 3 euros, to buy a plant that's taken 3 years to grow and has traveled the entire world. What allows us to do that? And it's the power of technology. And so technology is lowering the costs fundamentally and dramatically. And I know this chart is a little difficult to understand. Mark Twain once said that Wagner's music is better than it sounds. I think this chart might be better than it looks. But there's an intuition here that I really want you to understand, because a question you might have is, how does an orchid get to be better and cheaper at the same time? And why is an orchid better? An orchid's better because it actually blooms for 3 months, maybe more. Sometimes the blooms last for a year. But they're also phenomenally cheap. And so how do we see that happening today? Well, 2 things are doing that. One is the deflationary pressures that technology puts on everything. And it's not just Moore's law, reducing the costs of chips. It's the lowering of manufacturing costs, the lowering of sales and distribution costs, right? So that blue line at the bottom there, we see deflationary pressure on lots of different components of the costs of our products, right? How many folks here have seen deflationary pressure in their businesses? Right, everybody. There are those who say yes and those who are probably not admitting it. But I think we're all seeing a lot of deflationary pressure in our business. But there's something else. There's another cost that's getting lowered because of technology and digital technology, and that's the cost of innovation. So the ways that we're able to bring out new products and the ways that we develop new products, things like crowdsourcing, open source communities, this ability to create new products using the market as a mechanism, that lowers the costs of innovation. And we'll talk a little bit about combinatorial innovation. Combinatorial innovation is this ability to see all of the parts in the supply chain. So what happens now is we build new products off of off-the-shelf parts. All of this lowers the costs of innovation. What happens is when you spend less on innovation than you save because of deflation, you can actually make the next product better and cheaper. So think about this. Let me give you a real example so we can understand that. Think about automobiles. Automobiles have $4,000 to $8,000 on average of electronics in the car, right? Every 2 years, Moore's law says that electronics is going to be either twice as powerful or half the price, right? We get that. So the interesting thing is just the $4,000 component of electronics in the car will be $2,000 in a couple of years, roughly. So on an average car, a U.S. average car sale is about $26,000. On a $26,000 car, that price of the car now comes to $24,000 unless you innovate or unless you lower your price. And so you see the revenue pressures that happen because of that. So every year we have that challenge. Now, if you can innovate at less than that $2,000, you can have a new car, a new product that's cheaper and better. Let's think of another product that we know like that. How many people have a navigation system in their car? Everybody? Now, this is always a bit of a tricky question, which is how many people love their navigation system in their car? Absolutely love it. Just love that. I see a couple of hands in the back. It's probably pretty good. Question is, when's the last time you updated that system, right? I know when I went to the dealer and wanted an update, they said it was going to be $400 US. That's a lot of money for an update, right? Not to mention a lot of times because it's not updated, I don't know the streets, I don't know where it goes. Plus when I'm trying to make a phone call and trying to go to the place that I'm talking to on the phone, it doesn't integrate, right? So it's not a great, perfect product in the standalone GPS system. How many people here have a navigation system on their phone? Almost everybody, right? How many people like that? There can be some hands. It's great. Why is the phone nav system great, or at least pretty darn good? It's free. It's updated constantly, and in fact, Google Navigation was originally called Google Navigation Beta, because not only was the data updated continuously, but the software was continuously updated. Unbeknownst to you, they were downloading the updates to your phone. The other thing is it was more customer intimate. It works with your phone, it works with your phone list, it works with your Google searches when you use the internet. Now, why do I mention these three dimensions in particular? These three dimensions actually match up to three of the traditional ideas of strategy, right? Some of you know Michael Porter, you've read his books on strategy. Michael Porter talked about three generic strategies that a business can follow. You can be low cost, you can be differentiated, or you can be niche, customer intimate. But you can't be more than one, because otherwise you'll wind up in a muddle, you'll straddle your strategy, and you can't actually be all three, because that would just be crazy. But in fact, we think today companies are being all three, and Google Nav is a good example. This is undisciplined strategy, where you actually use all three generic strategy dimensions at the same time, and that's how you win. Now, this would be nothing but an interesting story if it wasn't interesting to look at what happened to Garmin and TomTom, the major competitors, at the same time. So 2007 is when Google Nav was introduced. You see just about over there. The red line is what Garmin projected. The blue line is what would have been projected based on some new information that was coming through. And the yellow line is the actual line of what happened to their sales. That's the Big Bang disruption. It's this intercepting on the curve. Most of us are familiar with S-curves of business, right? You start out slowly, you climb an S-curve, it comes off, it matures. In fact, our last book was called Jumping the S-Curve. We talked about how you jump S-curves. What we see with Big Bang disruption is you don't get the full life cycle of your S-curve anymore. You get interrupted somewhere in the middle by a new company that's better, cheaper, and more customer intimate. We think this actually creates a fourth era of innovation that we need to be thinking about. As CFOs, as executives of all sorts, we always understood innovation from the top down. If I spend a lot of money, I can invent new things. I can create a Rolls Royce. I can create anti-lock brakes. I can create that new stuff. It costs money, and I generally pass it on to the customers willing to pay the most. And it trickles down to the mass market. So at first, power windows were an option. Now they're pretty much standard on every car, except the most recent car I got to let my children use. So there's one car still with roll-up windows, but power windows are pretty much in a car. You actually have to look for it not to be there. Innovator's Dilemma was Clay Christensen's insight, and what he said, and we want to think about, is the disruption that comes from cheaper and not as good. because sometimes customers don't need all the great features that we provide in a product, right? So we can actually have products that come from the bottom up. And one of his examples there was heavy machinery using hydraulics instead of cables. Some of us may be old enough to remember when you would see a crane that actually had cables moving instead of hydraulics, right? Well, hydraulics leaked. Hydraulics couldn't really handle a lot of weight until over time. But so that was innovation from the bottom up. The third form of innovation, how many people here have heard of Blue Ocean Strategy? Pretty popular book, him and Bourgeois. What they said is actually what you can do is you can do it from the top down or the bottom up. You just mix up the features. Some will be more expensive, some will be less expensive, but you can create a new product for a new market. And that was Blue Ocean Strategy. And that works. You have Formula One Hotels as a business hotel. No chandeliers, no nice flowers in the lobby, because business folks don't really care about those things. But they care about nice beds, they care about a desk. So you provide those features. And that's what Formula One did very successfully to find a new market. What we're talking about in this era now is the era of Big Bang disruption, that we have a new set of innovation where your competitors are not going to come from any of those directions. Your competitors are going to attack you on all three dimensions simultaneously, unless you beat them to it. Now, I want to make sure that we understand that this is not just a single individual industry. This is not a consumer electronics phenomenon. Here's just a few of the ways and a few of the industries that we're seeing it going across, and a number of the traditional markets that have been disrupted in this way. How many folks know of Uber or have used Uber? Yeah, a lot of folks. Again, what's interesting there, the reason I like to point out that as an example is because oftentimes we think, well, we're in a physical business and that physical businesses are free from the threat of a digital disruption like this. Because who owns a lot of cars? Who could bring that many cars to the market? And in fact, what we find is you don't have to do that to create a big bang disruption. You simply have to control the information layer, right? So what's the most valuable and important thing to have in the limo or taxi service business? It's not having a taxi, it's having the knowledge of who wants a taxi and where the taxis are located. That's where the value is in the matching of that, right? It's not in having a taxi. And it turns out that the taxis become subordinate to those that control the information. So much so that, in fact, they've had huge uprisings. Some of you may have seen that the taxi drivers have picketed and created all kinds of chaos in terms of trying to protect their market. And we'll talk about regulation in a little bit. But so they try and do that. The same thing happens again and again in these different industries. Now, I want to point out some of what's really important about what happens when we have Big Bang disruptions, and that's one of our traditional models of business and technology diffusion actually changes. So how many people recognize this bell curve with these segments? It's called the technology diffusion curve. Everett Rogers identified this, and what was interesting is that he said that these traditional market segments, we actually know how big they are. Innovators are actually 2.5%, almost always, of every market that diffuses along the bell curve. Early adopters are about 13.5%, early majority, late majority, and laggards. What we've seen from our study is that actually this shape no longer holds true. As this curve compresses, we see a very different shape emerging. And we all understand how this has occurred, that these curves are shortening. Well, what happens is at a certain point, you can't accelerate your way to the shorter curves, is the first principle, is that we try and accelerate. As the curves get shorter and shorter, we try and accelerate every piece of what we do. At some point, that no longer works. And the second point is that we no longer have these traditional segments anymore. In fact, we think there are only two new segments, trial users and everyone else. And why would that be? When you think about it, if you're offering a product that's better and cheaper and more customer intimate, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want better and cheaper? Everybody wants better and cheaper, right? So what happens to adoption? Adoption happens almost instantaneously, right? In this world of near-perfect market information, consumers don't wait around to find out weeks, months, years what the best product is. They find out instantly. I'll give you an example. My co-author and I were in New York, and we were looking late at night. We were writing the book, and we were looking for a restaurant. And he's a vegetarian, so that made it a little trickier. 10:30 at night, we turned around the corner, and we found a Thai restaurant. Now, you say, did we walk into the Thai restaurant? No. What we did is we pulled out our cell phones and we looked up at Yelp and Google and other things to see, TripAdvisor, to see if the restaurant was any good. So the idea is that the cost of search is now lower than the cost of regret for everything. Customers are going to be instantly informed about everything, and when a product is really good, demand is going to skyrocket. But then we have the same thing which happens when markets saturate. We have a dramatic fall off and the market disappears, at least until another big bang disruptor comes along. So we think there are 4 important stages that businesses need to think about now. We borrow the language from Big Bang of the universe, but we think there are 4 new stages of market development and diffusion that companies need to think about. The first is the singularity, which is where the market experiments and tries to figure out how to make something that's better and cheaper. The Big Bang, when the market finds out that it exists. The Big Crunch, after we've saturated the market. And entropy, where companies are forced to think about how do I repurpose all that I've created for the next stage. These 4 stages create 4 new imperatives for companies. The first is greater foresight, right? If I no longer have early adopters, because early adopters know whether the product's good or not, then I can't rely on early adopters to tell me which companies are going to be valuable in the future, so I can't look for startup companies in the late stages anymore. And I also can't use those early adopters to fund innovation. So we need to be thinking about how we fund innovation differently. Scaling management becomes the challenge in the second phase, asset freedom and game mastery, and end game mastery. So I'd like to close by just taking you through 4 quick examples in each of the phases to help us understand some of the ways that strategy has to change and our activities have to change and how this relates to CFOs. In the first stage, because there aren't early adopters anymore, we need to understand the inevitable truth. When early adopters don't finance early stage innovation, we need other ways of figuring out what's going to succeed and what won't. And one of the ways we talk about is finding your truth tellers. Truth tellers come from soap operas. Anybody know the term truth teller? In soap operas, a truth teller is the person that comes on stage to reveal the secret that, oh, she has a twin sister, and that's why strange things have been happening. But the important thing is the truth teller helps connect the future and link the story from the past and the uncertainty to the future. And so we ask, who are the truth tellers in our industry? And for example, in pinball, the truth tellers were the designers of pinball machines, because early on, the designers of pinball machines became the designers of video arcade games. It was the same people. They had moved because they had seen the writing on the wall. They knew where the industry was heading early, and those are the people we need to watch for. The second example I would give you is managing catastrophic success, which is this idea that if customers come to us all at once, how do we manage that kind of demand? Microsoft Connect, the nice thing that you move in front of to operate video, 10 million units in 2 months, 6 million units in the next 12 months, 4 million units in the next year and a half. A shark fin. But as CFOs, we have to think about how do we scale our business like that, but also we have to worry about inventory, right? How do we handle 10 million units of demand that might actually be 5 million units, and a market and a window of opportunity that may only be a few weeks or a few months, maybe even less. Kindle is a good example here. One of the rules that we talk about in the book is timing the market. And what's interesting is how many types of e-reader did Amazon make before it introduced the Kindle, the successful Kindle? If you think about that market, they didn't have any early products, right? They were not the first mover by any stretch. What was important is that they knew exactly what the customer wanted in the product, and they knew the pace of technology and at what point technology was going to create that product affordably. So they had a $2.99 consumer price point they wanted. They knew the contrast level they had to have. They knew the battery life that the consumer wanted. And so they knew when they timed the market to when the successful product would happen and made sure that they were there when it happened. I won't go too much into this. I like this example because it's a Dutch example, but I know there's better experts than myself about this. But managing the crunch is all about how do we think about exiting the assets that we create for our businesses. Oftentimes we think about all the stuff we have to invest in to get into a business, but we don't think about how we're going to get out of it. We like to use Philips because if you think of Philips and their lighting business, they recognize the inevitability of getting out of incandescent bulbs. And that we think is a big bang as well because legislation, at least in the US, is one of the big drivers of exiting incandescent bulbs, right? Incandescent bulbs went out of business gradually, then suddenly, because by law, you can't sell a 40 or 60 watt incandescent bulb in the US after last January 1st. That's how a business disappears in an instant. But not if a company like Philips recognizes the inevitable future and manages its assets and its businesses to the inevitable future. And the last one I want to talk about is repurposing our business, because in a world where we use and create innovation through off-the-shelf parts and the recombination of things, this transparency of our supply chain, it becomes more and more important that businesses actually participate in the global supply chain and move to different industries. An example there is Kodak and Fujifilm. Everybody knows Kodak went bankrupt, right? But most people don't know that Fujifilm is actually alive and doing pretty well right now. And the reason for that is because in order to compete on scale with Kodak, they actually had to go to a lot of different industries with their technologies and sell it to the cosmetics industry, to the consumer electronics industry. Almost every television in the world today has a Fujifilm layer, anti-glare layer of film in front of it. So thinking about our next step becomes critical, our end game strategy. So with that, I'll just close with a couple of questions to consider. Hopefully something in this sparks some interest in what you're doing. So how much are you willing to spend on innovation? What experiments should you be funding? What is your capacity for scaling? How do you get to that 10 million units if you need to and if the world wants it? What's the real value of your current assets, and what would it be if a big bang hit? You can think of Nokia, for example, right? One day it's worth a lot. The next day its assets are worth almost nothing. And then what role can the CFO play in repurposing offerings into new industries? Which I think is a really interesting question for us today, which is how are we bringing the vision of broader impact to our companies? And that's where I'll leave it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Nunes, thank you very much. One question, Paul. Because actually the last question is very interesting. So what is, because everybody's going home very inspired, etc., and they're getting to their jobs tomorrow and think, okay, what should I do next? So the question is, in this new world of big bang innovation, what is the role of the CFO? Which first steps should they take tomorrow?
I would break down the steps for tomorrow into the 4 stages that we looked at, and I would probably organize activities in each of the 4 steps.
Right.
The first one is to rethink your spending on innovation. Mm-hmm. Are you doing traditional R&D, or are you actually looking at in-market experiments? Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. I was working with a company recently. They were interested in an idea. We came up with, so we'll do a $2 million feasibility study. We said, no, $2 million, we'll have it for you in a week with some startup in California. So we need to rethink how we invest in the innovation and look forward. We need to think about scaling. Who do we partner with to achieve the kind of capability and capacity that we want to create by creating extraordinary demand? Mm-hmm. We want to think about the third stage is getting the true value of our assets. What are our assets really worth? And one of the things we say is that our assets are only worth what the business is worth. Oftentimes on our books, we have our factories, we have a lot of assets that we think, we use residual values of. But in fact, if the business goes away, like in Nokia, the value of those assets goes away.
Yeah, right.
And then the last thing to be thinking about is this repurposing. And so I would think that the CFOs need to be thinking about if there's residual value to our businesses and our capabilities, we need to understand what that value is and how it can be derived from industries that are not our own.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen,
Long
give him an
answer.
applause. Well, no, it's a good answer. Paul Nunes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Big bang disruption. Wow.